Okay, guys, let's take a look at the Revolutionary Era. Sometimes called the Revolutionary War moment or the War for Independence, terms kind of used interchangeably. I take a look as the era from the French and Indian War through the writing and adoption of the 1783 Treaty of Paris as being that revolutionary era or period, if you will. The War for Independence itself, to me, speaks to the moment from essentially Lexington and Concord all the way through Yorktown. So that's specifically the actual war for American independence from Great Britain. All right, so let's go on and get into this thing today. So just to kind of bring you back up to speed, if you haven't taken a look at the colonial era in a little bit, let's make sure you're caught up on that. During the Age of Exploration, this is like the also known as the Age of Sail moment. This is a time where the European empires are kind of reaching out and seeing what else is out there. They explore Africa, the oceans through the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic. They're looking for easier routes for trade and better ways to gain more money without having to go through the Italian monopoly, if you will, of the Mediterranean Sea with the Arab nations. They're also trying to find good land, and they're doing so for a couple of reasons, but namely, God, gold, and glory tends to work for most expansions of European empires at this time. England is going to do settlement and colonization a little bit differently than their Dutch and Spanish predecessors, if you will. England actually looks at originally ways to do this cheaply. So they figure, okay, well, this allows some private investors to kind of pool their money together, and that's where we get this idea of a joint stock company or joint stock charter. You pull all your money together, and the board elects a guy who's going to kind of captain up the colonization effort, and the king allows them to have the land. So, it works out. The royal throne kind of pocketbook, if you will, isn't really out on any kind of a loan. These are all privately funded, and for the most part, that's how a lot of English colonies, especially North America, are settled, namely Virginia. So 1607 is the first permanent settlement of England in North America. That would be Jamestown, Virginia, in the Chesapeake Bay area. Now, of course, there's the Roanoke colony, but if you remember from your reading from the video notes, well, Roanoke's not really there anymore. And no one's really 100% sure what happened. There's a lot of pretty cool conspiracies to that. If you're interested in it, maybe make that your term paper topic. But here in 1607 in Virginia, and pretty soon after there comes Massachusetts, and we started expanding the colonies out. We take over the Dutch in New York and New Jersey, and it's an interesting moment how the colonies are actually formed over about 100 or so years. So England, namely, creates 13 colonies in North America, and each one is a little different, and they essentially get thrown into three zones: the north being New England, middle colonies, the breadbasket colonies, and then the south. This is where the plantation system really takes root in American and English history in North America. So we're looking at, in New England, shipping and lumber trade and fishing really being like the majority kind of routes for monetary success you'll find in the New World. There's a lot of big port cities, especially Boston, Massachusetts, Fairmouth, Portsmouth, so on and so forth. And the middle colonies, that's where it's a good climate. There's a lot of open land. It's a lot of lush land. It allows for some medium-sized urban centers to pop up. So we're seeing, like, especially Pennsylvania area and New York in this region. And they're really known for having, again, pretty decent harbors and ports. You can't really underspeak to how excellent it was to get Manhattan Island and New York in general for such a cheap price. There's a lot of anger over that for historians as well when you look at things. Is it really fair that America and England were able to capture from the Dutch, and the Dutch capture from the Indians, even though they kind of purchased it for such a low price, such very valuable real estate? Maybe kind of manipulative, but at the same time, conquest is the world history. And, America is no exception to that rule. Neither are the European empires, despite how they choose not to look for some of their history of, a 200 or 300 year period of what they did taking over Africa and Asia and the Americas. But America here, the United States of America, we're really kind of stuck to this heritage as being ours, and we get a lot of criticism for that as well. So keep that distinction in mind here. Now, the economics and government setups that we're going to use in these new colonies kind of differ just a bit. The Columbian Exchange really brings a lot of new crops and new systems, a lot of new economic ideas and capabilities from the old world, that's Europe, into the new world. The Native Americans, they traded a lot. There's this idea that Native Americans, especially in South and Central America, before Columbus and the following Spanish and French and English invasions happened, that they didn't really trade, but they did. They traded quite a bit. There's actually a lot of evidence from archaeology now showing that we're talking like Indians all the way down in modern day Chile who are actually trading with North American Pueblo Indians and the such, and there's a lot of interconnectedness between them. So it's not as if when Spain came over that all of a sudden the Native Americans were like forced to quickly modernize, because by and large they didn't modernize by European standards. But they still had their own way of doing things, especially with cleanliness. When you look at that kind of rating of what the Native Americans considered to be clean and hygienic versus what the Europeans did, we're talking on like taking daily baths and such for the Native Americans or some tribes, whereas some Europeans, they have like a bath maybe once a month or so, and it's not really any good way to live. But they didn't really think of it that way. And remember, when the European expansion into the Americas is really beginning, that's on the tail end of everything bad that happened to Europe. This is on the tail end of the Black Death and the Black Plague. And where you're talking in some places 70% death in some cities, some places even more than that. But generally about 1 out of 3 people in Europe during this time period had passed away. So it's on the tail end of that, and they bring a lot of these diseases to the Native Americans. Now, the Native Americans also give a special disease back to the Europeans, who would kind of rape and pillage and do some other interesting things to the Native American populations. Syphilis was a pretty terrible STD at the time. We're also talking on this expansion of new commerce, and we're looking at all this new territory and land. And unfortunately, once the Native American populations start dwindling down, well, the Europeans see it as a moment to, hey, let's bring in new labor sources. So they bring in indentured servants for the English, and a couple slaves, sure. But the original African slave trade really comes into the Spanish Empire and to the Dutch islands. And so we're talking Middle and South America is where the majority of the African slaves actually came directly to. Now, as you know anything about American history, eventually the United States of America is going to start bringing in more and more slaves into the continental United States. Especially true as we move into the 19th century after all the wars for independence. So it's not as if the United States is immune from that. I don't want you to get that impression. What happened with the history of slavery in the United States is awful. It's atrocious. The idea of ever owning a person and doing whatever you want with them, that's terrible. But don't also forget that indentured servants had anywhere from a 4 to 7 year span, and you're going to add years onto that if the owner of the indentured servant wanted to add even more labor to them. And it's kind of a weird thing to think about, but don't think of this as an apologetic phrase for slavery, because it's not meant to be. But think about indentured servants. If you have a leased car, are you going to take pretty good care of it? Sure. For that 3 years that you have a lease, you're going to take good care of it. And likewise, if you're essentially leasing a human being with an indentured servant at this time, you're going to take decent care of them. But if you own the entire car, and let's say that if you know that if you miss a payment to your bank for, let's say, like a 6-year payoff of a car, that you lose all of it, and you want this car to be around for, say, like 10 to 15 years, because some cars can do that, you're going to take even better care of it. So a lot of times you'll see indentured servants actually working alongside slaves, but slaves actually getting better and more food. It's not always the case, but don't overlook the entirety of the labor system. And it is most certainly what they thought to be a necessary labor pool to bring in indentured servants into the English colonies and slaves, and then eventually slaves replace the indentured servants after Bacon's Rebellion. But there's this, it's an interesting history, and it's really more for its own class and its own discussion, slavery history in the New World, in the Americas. But don't try to minimalize it ever, and don't ever think that maybe the United States isn't really as susceptible or as responsible for it as other places, because we still imported a lot. And I say we very strongly because it was the United States who would actually continue along this idea of the slave trade well after the English actually stopped doing the international slave trade. So England is going to adopt this idea of mercantilism. Sorry, back to the PowerPoint here. But with mercantilism, we have this idea that colonies exist essentially to enrich the mother country, and that's about it. So as part of the Columbian Exchange, especially for England, you would take the raw materials away from the colonies, you would ship them back to England where they would be honed and mass-produced into finished products and goods and manufactured goods in general, and then they would sell them back to the colonies. That sounds a little twisted, right? Because you think on it, especially some of the northern cities like Boston, New York, and such, they would actually eventually start building their own factories, and they would actually be able to refine their own goods. And because a lot of colonists got tired of basically the mother country, in this case England, being able to take all their raw goods and do whatever they want with it and sell it back to the colonists, well, a lot of people didn't really like that. A lot of people wanted to get, say, like Spanish goods or Dutch goods or French goods or whatever else they can trade for with the Caribbean, so relatively geographically close to them. So there was a lot of smuggling going on, because under mercantilism you're also supposed to only buy from the mother country. And of course, one of the famous American pastimes, smuggling. Why not, right? If you can get a good that's tastes as good or is as good in quality, if it's like a writing piece or something, why wouldn't you just pay the cheaper price and get it from a smuggled merchant? Why not? So even despite a lot of these trade restrictions, colonists are still, for the most part, trading legally with England and enriching them. Now, the colonial governments kind of differed from colony to colony, but in general, once the majority of them became royal colonies, they had councils and colonial assemblies. They had a royal governor who was usually handpicked by the king himself, or sometimes the prime minister would have some say in it. They would kind of oversee the day-to-day affairs of things and put judges into place to make sure things were still going on with English law, and to make sure that idea of salutary neglect was still going on. This idea that, let the American colonies do what they will with things, as long as they're still, following most of the big important principles of paying taxes to the mother country and allowing mercantilism to succeed. Whatever, let them go. Now, Americans are also going to create their own assemblies. And this is another one of our heritage points in America. It's one of our core values, if you will, of having self-governance. And we're able to do this because we're a couple thousand miles away from England. And you might be thinking in your head, if you know anything on English history, well, how come the Indians didn't do that in modern-day India? They did to an extent, but that's more of a world history thing. But here in America, it became this incredibly wealthy set of colonies. The 13 colonies are a pretty substantial portion of the British GDP at the time. So we had a little more leniency with things. And because they're still English citizens here in the colonies, that's different than the Indians being English citizens as well. There is a little bit of racism in there. So we get into the French Indian War starting around 1754. George Washington, as a 22-year-old at the time, really kind of sparks this war. He's given orders to go march into the Ohio River Valley, Ohio River Valley being like the key piece of territory that's going to be fought and vied over between Indian tribes allied either with England or France or with the colonies. And Washington delivers this message, kind of politely asking the French to vacate the Ohio River Valley. And they're like, English citizens are kind of moving out west. We've already claimed this territory. But the French are like, well hang on, so do we. This is our territory as well. And if you look on the map here, New France was kind of this large piece of territory that was just everything west of the Appalachian Mountains, essentially, the Ohio River Valley, the Great Lakes regions we know today, the middle part and the plains regions of North America. France claimed a lot of that. England hadn't, because England had chosen to stay very close to the Atlantic basin because it's easier that way, right? It's easier to trade with that. But as more and more people are brought over and more people are born in the English American 13 colonies, you're going to have to deal with the idea of population distribution and expansion and people wanting land. Plus, think of the indentured servants. They're promised land after they finish their indentured period. And then you have more people coming over here because there's land to buy. Now, it's kind of weird to think about, but in England proper in the 1700s, we're talking about the majority of the land being owned by the wealthiest, 1 to 10% of the population, the nobility, if you will. They have no motivation to sell that off to common peasants, essentially, that want to try to find their way into a middle class. But in the colonies, a middle class of entrepreneurs actually does develop, and England doesn't really have a good response to it. So they let it go forth, and it sparks a war. So George Washington is a 22-year-old. He builds Fort Necessity, and ends up that the French will attack with the Indians, of course. They're Indian allies. George Washington loses. Fort Necessity was kind of very aptly named Necessity. He built it because he needed some place, I need a wall. Something like that. I'm going to build a wall on 4 sides here at the bottom of a ravine, and who knows, maybe it won't rain on me. Well, it rains a lot. And, it gets money, and a lot of Washington's troops are pretty disgusted with what's going on. So he negotiates a surrender, and he kind of promises not to get involved in military affairs, and he walks back to Virginia, and that sparks a global war known as the 7 Years' War, or in the North American continent, we're talking of the French and Indian War. So at the end of the French-Indian War, because, it just in brief, the French actually win a lot early on, and a lot of that's just because they have a larger army force there. They have more Indian allies. If you remember from your colonial period exploration and history, the French have a softer relationship with the Native American tribes, so they're a little more, I guess, not necessarily happy to oblige the French, but they're a lot more likely to ally themselves with the French and trade with the French than they were with the English. The English brought over permanent colonies. The French had very small cities, very few forts. They were there for the fur trade, essentially. And so the Native American tribes in that territory were a lot more likely to ally themselves with the French. And they were betting that the French were going to win this war. Well, they were for a while. And then England got its act together and started hiring Prussian mercenaries to fight in the European theater. And they started paying for some of the militias, and they started paying for more regular troops to come to the North American continent, and eventually won over. I mean, this is the English period in world history. There's no mistake about it. England controlled the seas. They controlled just about everything. So eventually they were going to win the war. And a lot of people thought that with the American Revolution as well. So in 1763, we have another French Treaty of Paris. And in this case, England is going to officially get essentially all French lands east of the Mississippi River. Now, if you look at that geographically, I mean, we're talking a substantial piece of land was won for the English settlers and England proper. We're talking about essentially more than doubling their size geographically, because remember, they had been kind of stuck along the Appalachian Mountains without going into further west territories and fighting with different Indian tribes and the French. Now they had all the territory up to the Mississippi River. And then England does some pretty stupid things. This is one of the greatest mistakes, I think, that England does in its history. They take a look at the massive war debt, because, I mean, it was a world war. It was a lot of money. Very expensive to pay for mercenaries in Europe and for war in North America and this large naval combat in the Indian, Atlantic, Pacific Oceans. I mean, it was a large war. And England is going to decide that, this policy of salutary neglect has been okay, but we think that the American colonists should start paying their fair share. But they do it very quickly, and they don't do it with much justification for things. They don't communicate it very well. Nowadays, we get a new tax when we pass a new bill for something, say like we want more health insurance coverage, or we want oversight for X, Y, and Z program, or we want more toll roads. Well, we put it to a vote and we get feedback, and these are our elected representatives who pass these taxes and tolls and whatnot on to us. We didn't have that. And it's kind of like this overgeneralization of things. But you think on it, and had America, the 13 colonies, actually been given even like one seat in the House of Commons, I wonder, and this is one of the great what-ifs in history, especially American history, could the entire war for independence have been avoided? Would we be English citizens today? I don't know. It's an interesting what-if scenario. But England decided that they were going to pass a series of taxes to kind of bring the American colonists back up to paying their fair share. Statistically and economically, yes. England was justified in doing so because, just by the numbers, the American colonists were paying substantially less than other English colonies and compared to English citizens proper on the island itself. So they're going to pass some taxes. I mean, what else are you going to do? You got to go and pay for the war, right? Colonists, however, didn't like that. And they didn't like that, they had their own existing tax system set up to where, tax collectors weren't necessarily full-time jobs everywhere. It might be a newspaper printer, or even like a pastor or a deacon in a church or something, who would part-time on like one day a week go around and collect the taxes for the towns and send it up the chain. And it wasn't really a full-time job, and people respected it because this was an elected person from a lot of their colonial assemblies. Now, however, there's English tax collectors coming over, and they started off with a bang. In 1763, remember, we had just gotten all this new land, all the way to the Mississippi River. That's a lot of land for the American colonists, and they wanted to go out there and settle it. There's this Indian war that pops up called Pontiac's Rebellion. And Pontiac gets a lot of the existing Indian tribes who had thought, maybe allying with the French would be a good idea. Oops. They all ally together, and they're raiding English villages and towns and military holding sites, so on and so forth. It's not very good. Eventually, England has to send over regular troops to put down that rebellion, which they do. It costs more money. But because of that, English Parliament looks at that moment and says, well, you know what? We don't want any English colonists or settlers moving west of the Appalachian Mountains after all. Even though we just want all this land. And understand, the American colonists themselves had volunteered and done the majority of fighting in North America. So it's kind of a serious slap in the face, if you go to war to control land and then you win that land, but you're told by your government you can't go settle that land. That's like a really terrible mistake, England. It makes very little sense. And anyways, the colonists go on to defy that law, and they start settling out there anyways. They find their own ways out there at their own risk. Then England passes the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act is pretty serious because it kind of irritates the two parts of the population that you never want to anger at the same time. We're talking journalists and lawyers. Now, here's my thinking on this. You irritate a lot of lawyers. Well, they know the law, and they have a pretty good sense of how to get some support and how to, rationalize things and communicate it. And even more so, the journalists know how to get public support for their ideas. So the Stamp Act was pretty serious because it's a stamp on every papered good. I mean, understand, this is a time when the American English colonists were very literate, especially compared to other places of the world, especially colonies. So when you start taxing each piece of paper, like even like playing cards and the such, well, people don't like that. They don't like it at all. And for some who are outside of the major cities, it takes a while for like the notification to get to them. Like, hey, this is a tax to pay off the war that we just fought. But my son died in that war, so I don't understand. Like, I've paid enough, haven't I? So a lot of people get really irritated by it. And like I say, you never want to irritate these two parts of society, lawyers and journalists. It's a bad thing. And as it happens, we adopt that very infamous slogan, no taxation without representation. And Congress is going to respond to this kind of violently. We're talking fires, we're talking protests, we're talking outright boycotts. There's a lot done. And out of this reaction comes the groups of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. And, kind of like the first American homegrown terrorist organization. These are the people who would eventually start tar and feathering tax collectors and do some pretty atrocious things, but also kind of would justify it as very patriotic things as well. So colonists, while they're boycotting these goods, are starting kind of like local systems on how to make their own goods. So women assemblies will actually be encouraged to, since we don't want to like buy paper from England at this time because it's all taxed, how can we start getting paper goods, say, from Spain or from France? Which is ironic because we were just at war with France, but whatever. We want to smuggle it in, we want to distribute it, we want to distribute it quickly. And later on, as more items are taxed, well, the Daughters of Liberty will actually start to put together sewing circles and find ways to actually make America self-sufficient. And that actually becomes another core value of America, I would argue. This idea of always fighting for, and it's always popular even today in modern politics to say that we're going to be self-sufficient on, say, energy or oil or the such. That's where it all came from. It's one of our core values as a community, as a society. Now, these boycotts were so effective that Parliament actually takes a look at it and they're like, okay, well, maybe we should like take away some of the authority of these colonial assemblies and make sure they understand that England can do it at once because we're the mother country. We're the head honcho. We're the guy in charge of the empire. You're still imperial citizens. Accept that. So that they do go on and actually, with the Stamp Act Congress, a lot of acts are passed and a lot of letters are sent, and eventually Parliament takes away the Stamp Act. But then they pass what's called the Declaratory Act, which is one of the most ridiculous pieces of English law ever. It really actually just comes out and says it. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but this notion that, hey, if you're going to be English citizens, expect to be taxed. And we as England can tax you whenever we want and for whatever we want. You're colonists. You should expect that and embrace it. So the Stamp Act is repealed, and Britain is going to then move on to other ways to generate some revenue for its war debts. So we passed the Townshend Acts in 67. We move on from there, and there's the whole timeline of events for taxes is really kind of interesting to look at. But in 1770, because of the Townshend Acts, there's this moment in Boston's history where a mob is kind of growing outside a tax house, and it just, you know how the story goes. And it's personified for the public who weren't in Boston by Paul Revere in this famous drawing here that he puts in newspapers throughout the colonies. The British soldiers actually commanded by their officer there to go on fire into the crowd. Well, of course that's going to irritate people. Colonial agitators are going to actually label it as the Boston Massacre. What's interesting about the 1770 so-called Boston Massacre is that a future president and vice president, John Adams, one of the more respected lawyers at the time in Boston, is actually brought in, and he agrees to defend the British redcoats who actually fired on the mob. And he gets them acquitted. Because, yeah, they were taunted, they had things thrown at them. We can't say for sure who shot first. Was it a colonial who shot at the British and they were just responding? You don't know. There's a lot of reasonable doubt in the case. Nonetheless, the damage had been done. Now, of course, John Adams is going to come over to the rebel side here pretty quickly because eventually England actually takes away the American lawyer's capability to do trials in the colonies, and that's a slap in the face to all lawyers. Once again, lawyers and journalists, that's two parts of the population everyone irritate at the same time. Now, in 1773, a new tea act is passed, and it's trying to help out the British company, the East India Company, to make money because they're kind of seeing some trouble in their revenue making. They're having trouble paying their own taxes and fees and the such, and well, they figure, okay, the English colonists in America like to have tea. They have a lot of sources of tea. Let's just go on and make a monopoly of it and say all tea in the colonies will be sourced from the British East India Company. Now, understand that the tea that is sold to the American colonists is very cheap. Cheaper than the tea that they were used to paying for, which sounds like a good deal, right? But the principle of monopoly is anti-freedom. Think of it. When we go into a grocery store today, we have dozens, if not hundreds of options for even like cereal products. And we like that. We like choices, and we look at what we want and we find the best price for it. And sometimes we go so crazy that even as Americans today, we actually compare the prices of, say, I don't know, Fruit Loops from Walmart to Kroger's to HEB, and who's going to have the better deal. And well, we can all do that now. Remember that, like, we as Americans, we like choices. We like the freedom to choose what we want to buy. And sometimes we're actually willing to pay for a more expensive brand because of the brand. Maybe what their values are, or because it's just the social fad, but sometimes we do that. That's part of marketing and advertising. But here, England passes a monopoly and says everyone's going to buy East India Company tea. The colonists don't like that. So we dump almost 20,000 pounds of it into the Boston Harbor. There's this joke in environmental history that, like, this is where the Boston Harbor started to, like, really get polluted. It's kind of a fun joke for historians and something to think about. But of course there's going to be a reaction, and a very strong reaction from England because of this. So once word gets back to England that, okay, Boston, one of the bigger harbors in the 13 colonies, did all this, well, that's not good. We don't like that. That's a lot of lost money. So the King of Parliament actually closed Boston. They close the harbor. They start allowing troops to go and occupy Boston and control it, supposedly. And what we see happen from that is the 13 colonies take a look at Boston, and people start shipping goods for free, essentially, as some kind of like charity movement into Boston. Like we're talking, because their harbor's closed, a city that's basically run out of the economy and success of its harbor, well, they can't do anything. So the other colonies, once they hear about the closing of Boston Harbor, they're shipping everything under the sun that you could possibly think of. Clothing, cloths in general, textiles, food especially. Everything's being shipped, and it's coming from all over the 13 colonies. British officers are actually writing their diaries about this, and they actually report it in a lot of debriefings as well, that they can say, for as far as the eye can see, there are some days where there are lines of carts and oxen and horses bringing in goods to distribute throughout Boston proper. And they can't really do anything about it. So that shows this moment of unity. One thing I kind of forgot to mention was that the French and Indian War really had a great impact on the American colonies, because originally they had thought of themselves as, I'm a Virginian, or I'm a South Carolinian, or I'm a New Yorker. And they had these ideas they were so different from other colonies. And what they found fighting in war is that they shared a lot of the same problems and concerns, and they weren't so different after all. And with Ben Franklin's unity plan in Albany, we really start to see this actual creation of a real tangible union of colonies. And this moment in Boston, after the Intolerable Acts are first passed and the Port of Boston Act is passed, closing everything there, and the Quartering Act is passed, we start seeing a lot of support coming from all over the colonies. Following year, in 75, the shot heard around the world at Lexington takes place. And at this point, we have Paul Revere and William Dawes, who really kind of try to get the message out, like, hey guys, we know where the British troops are coming, because everyone knew it was going to happen. Because after what had happened in Boston, a lot of even smaller places had started to collect arms. And so right outside of Boston, we have the towns of Concord and Lexington. In Concord, we actually have a stash, a cache of different weapons and ammunition, swords, what have you, for the militias to use. And we start calling our militia the Minutemen, so that they were supposed to be ready at a minute's notice. And sure enough, at Lexington Concord, shots are fired between the British and the colonial rebels. And at this point, I think Britain kind of got the memo that this was a rebellion. It's no longer just protests and riots and boycotts. They're willing to fight and die for what they wanted. And we find a lot of inspiration for kind of justifying and getting people to buy in. Like the colonials, to buy into this idea of the revolutionary fervor at this time. The Americans in general were a lot more literate than other places in the world. I've said that. And we have a lot of new Enlightenment thinkers who have, since Thomas Hooker in Connecticut and earlier guys like John Locke, were starting to pass all these ideas around. they're actually fomenting and creating real tangible things in the American colonies. So we actually feed off the Enlightenment. We have this idea that there should be some kind of positive relationship, but one of accountability between the people and government. And the government kind of gets its power from the people. And when that stops, when the government starts becoming too controlling and they lose sight of their contract with the people, then there should be some kind of uprising. And sure enough, there would be. So John Locke writes out that people are born with these natural rights, including life, liberty, and property. Okay. Kings can be overthrown if they violate people's natural rights. And government power comes from the consent of the governed. We like all that. Now, we're going to have to get a lot of buy-in from all over the colonies and essentially throughout the world. We're going to do this massive revolution and rebellion and separate from England. And we need to be able to explain why and defend that. Because otherwise, we're going to see places like even France and Spain look at the American colonies in disgust. You're overthrowing a monarch, a king. What about the absolute right of control? God has put this monarch in charge of you to take care of you. How dare you defy that? And we have to defend that. We have to explain what's going on. So we write out this lengthy letter of abuses and ways that, based on our interpretation of how law should work, we start writing out the Declaration of Independence. A team of 3 plus a couple more who would read it and draft it. The actual penning is done by Thomas Jefferson himself. They serve it to the Continental Congress and say, hey, here is our declaration. And if you look at it, the Declaration of Independence is really at its roots a declaration of war. It's America's first declaration of war. We take a lot of these ideas that American colonists should consider themselves to be subjects and just get used to being stomped on, and we kind of transition that idea and the ideology, and we get through different pamphlets and different notes and speeches throughout the colonies public support for our new ideas. This idea that because of these abuses of the king and parliament, we should just go on and become independent ourselves. We've already proved that we can be self-sufficient in a lot of industries. Why not just do it in everything? So the so-called American philosophes really push this into play. Of course, we plagiarize off John Locke and create the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. John Adams Franklin, who was responsible for the Albany Planted Union, the French Indian War, and then Thomas Jefferson, this young upstart as well. We have some great thinkers who put the pen to everything. And if you know anything on the Declaration of Independence, you know that there's some tricky language in there that kind of bring into question slavery and women's rights as well. But of course, we're going to pass that on and deal with it later. So on July 4, 76, Americans are going to send the Declaration of Independence out. We send it to other world powers. We send it throughout the colonies. George Washington actually gets a copy of it and reads it to his soldiers. It explains what's going on. And we find key facets of the Enlightenment itself that we use to defend and justify our separation. So the actual fighting portion of the War for Independence, the American Revolution here, essentially from 75 to 83 with the Battle of Yorktown in 81 that really kind of stops a lot of the actual gunplay. And then 83, for a year and a half or so after the Battle of Yorktown, one of basically the last battle, then we have another Treaty of Paris that ends everything. Now, the key battles that I like to look at in the War for Independence are Trenton and Saratoga. And these two battles, to me, are kind of the turning points. In the Battle of Trenton, it was the winter, and Washington has already created this reputation for himself of strategic withdrawals being the way that we're going to fight the war. And militarily, he had to do that. I mean, you're talking, a couple thousand troops here and there for America versus tens of thousands, and sometimes versus the British. We weren't going to win that kind of a fight. We had a lot of boons for us. We had a lot of places where we actually knew the terrain better. We had a lot of advantages, but so did the British, and sheer numbers kind of sucked for the Americans throughout the war. That's why when at Trenton, Washington actually decides, hey, let's find a way, and he gets his boatsmen to help him out to get his small army across the Delaware River at night and attack at first light and go on and capture Trenton, great. After that, on to Princeton, another victory, great. Washington actually goes in the offensive for a little bit, then he retreats again. But it's that moment that, hey, we can actually win some battles. And that starts getting the international community thinking and looking at it. And especially the French, who obviously are really ticked off the British because they just, 20 years earlier lost everything in North America. They lost a lot. So they're looking for revenge, of course. And at the Battle of Saratoga, we finally convinced the French that they could come join our war effort and we would actually win. So the Battle of Saratoga is one of the most important turning points in early American history, because without that French alliance, I'm not sure how much longer the actual American War for Independence would have been successful. It's a great what if also of history. So once we have the French joining on board, now we actually have a navy. And, it's not to, shoot shots at the American quasi-navy under John Paul Jones, kind of raiding off in Europe, especially along the England island themselves. But we actually have a proper navy with France helping out. And France promises a lot more. The problem with that is that the French are now helping the Americans gain independence from their monarch. And, foreshadowing, the French people are also going to take a look at the American independence movement and be like, well, heck, why don't we throw off the control of the monarch and create our own government? Interesting idea. So the American War for Independence, our Revolutionary Era, really inspires the world. And it's not to be too cocky, but without the American Revolution, would there have been another triggering moment to where we see, especially in the New World, the Americas, all these Latin American countries gaining their independence and throwing off the control, the Spanish and other European controls? Would we see the French Revolution happen without the American Revolution? Will we see this movement away from centralized monarchies and empires without the American Revolution happening? And I don't know. It's another what if. So in 81, Yorktown, the battle, finally gets a surrender of a British superior commander. And in 83, another Treaty of Paris, right at 20 years or so after the other Treaty of Paris that ended the French-Indian War, we have a victory. The problem is that a lot of British troops actually stay in the forts in the Ohio River Valley and out west, and that kind of leads into the Second American Revolution with the War of 1812, kind of foreshadowing that as well. Alright, so let's go and wrap this up here pretty quick. The great change in world history that the American Revolutionary brings, like I said, is inspiration for massive change. And you can kind of take a look at the maps here with just what changed geographically for empire and land holdings. And from our inception as a country, the United States kind of moves for this large westward expansion, what we'd eventually term as manifest destiny. But we're going to do it a little differently. But is it really that different? And it's something you got to make your own evaluation of, because we most certainly do go to war with Native American tribes. We most certainly do, even in the case of Hawaii, only 100 years later, basically take over an entire island for an American fruit company. We go in and defeat the Spanish, also in 1898. Well, and we take territories from them. We're an empire too. And it's something to think about and criticize. But our empire is a little different also. And you'll get into more of that with the second semester of the American History Survey. So anyways, that's an overview of the Revolutionary period. Hope that helps you out with your studies. Have a